Some predators think they rule the concrete jungle because their victims are silent. But silence doesn't always mean weakness. Sometimes it means the real apex predators are watching from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This is the chilling true story of a bully who pushed the wrong kid. Every high school has a ghost. At Creston High, a sprawling brick-and-mortar purgatory nestled in the damp, overcast valleys of Oregon. That ghost was Leo Carmichael. Leo was 16, slightly built, and possessed an uncanny ability to blend into the painted cinder-block walls. He wore the same faded denim jacket every day, kept his eyes glued to the scuffed linoleum floors, and spoke only when absolute necessity demanded it. He wasn't antisocial. He was simply surviving. For a kid like Leo, invisibility was the only armor he had against the brutal hierarchy of teenage existence. But invisibility only works if the predators aren't actively hunting. Bradley Jenkins was the apex predator of Creston High. Brad was a towering 6'2" linebacker with a jawline carved from granite and an ego inflated by a town that worshipped Friday night football. Brad's father, Richard Jenkins, owned the largest chain of auto dealerships in the Tri-County area, effectively making Brad local royalty. His wealth and athletic prowess granted him a terrifying immunity. Teachers looked the other way when he was disruptive. The principal laughed at his cruel jokes. Brad ruled the hallways with a toxic mixture of charisma and intimidation, flanked always by his loyal cronies Greg and Donnie. For reasons Leo could never quite understand, Brad had chosen him as his favorite target. Perhaps it was because Leo never fought back, never told a teacher, and never gave Brad the satisfaction of a reaction. To a bully whose entire identity was built on dominating others, Leo's stoic silence was an unforgivable insult. The torment was a daily ritual meticulously designed to break Leo's spirit. It started with the accidental shoulder checks that sent Leo sprawling into the lockers, his notebooks scattering across the floor like autumn leaves. Then came the verbal abuse in the cafeteria, loud, mocking comments about Leo's thrift store clothes and his quiet demeanor. Brad would steal Leo's lunch, taking a single theatrical bite before dropping it into the trash can while laughing uproariously. "Eat up, ghost," Brad would sneer, patting Leo on the cheek with enough force to leave a stinging red mark. Leo endured it all with gritted teeth and deadened eyes. He had to. He lived alone with his ailing grandmother in a crumbling trailer park on the outskirts of town, and he couldn't afford the luxury of a suspension, let alone a hospital bill. He needed to keep his head down, graduate, and escape. However, Leo had a sanctuary. Every afternoon after the hell of Creston High, he walked 3 miles to the edge of the industrial district to a place called Sullivan's Garage. It was a cavernous, grease-stained cinder-block building that smelled of old motor oil, stale tobacco, and ozone. Leo worked there sweeping floors, organizing tool chests, and running parts for minimum wage. What the kids at Creston High didn't know, what Brad Jenkins didn't know, was that Sullivan's Garage was the unofficial clubhouse for the local charter of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. They were massive, bearded men, adorned in heavy denim and leather, their cuts bearing the infamous winged death's head logo. To the outside world, they were outlaws, dangerous men to be avoided at all costs, but inside the garage, there was a strict code of respect. Leo never intruded on their business. He did his job silently and efficiently. If a massive Harley-Davidson diner rolled into the bay, Leo was there with a rag and a wrench before the rider even asked. He brought them black coffee without being told, and he never ever lingered to listen to their conversations. Because of this, he earned the silent, unspoken respect of the chapter's sergeant-at-arms, a terrifying mountain of a man named Thomas Grit Callahan. Grit was a veteran road warrior with a braided beard, forearms covered in faded prison ink and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Grit had noticed Leo on day one. He watched the kid work his fingers to the bone, never complaining, never asking for a handout. More importantly, Grit noticed the bruises. He saw the yellowish-purple marks on Leo's forearms. He saw the slight limp when Leo walked in on a Tuesday afternoon. He saw the haunted, exhausted look in the teenager's eyes. Grit wasn't a social worker, and he wasn't prone to sentimentality, but he knew what a victim looked like. In the world of the Hells Angels, you didn't prey on the weak, you preyed on those who thought they were strong. One late Thursday afternoon, as Leo was sweeping near Grit's custom knucklehead chopper, Grit leaned against a workbench, lighting a cigarette. He took a drag, exhaled a thick cloud of blue smoke, and finally broke the silence. "You're bleeding, kid," Grit said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that vibrated in the chest. Leo froze, his knuckles turning white on the broom handle. He reached up and touched his split lip, wincing as his fingers came away, stained with fresh red blood. Brad had cornered him by the gym that afternoon, shoving him face first into a wire mesh fence just for the thrill of it. "I tripped, Mr. Callahan," Leo lied, his voice barely a whisper. He kept his eyes locked on the floor. Grit didn't push. He just stared at Leo for a long, heavy moment, his cold blue eyes piercing through the teenager's flimsy defense. "Flaws in this town must be getting mighty aggressive, Carmichael," Grit noted dryly. "Next time you trip, maybe you should look at what tripped you." Leo nodded quickly, retreating to the back of the garage. He didn't realize it, but that brief exchange had sealed a silent pact. Grit didn't need Leo to tell him what was happening. The sergeant-at-arms had a network, and he knew how to find things out. The shadows inside Sullivan's garage were beginning to stir, and the invisible kid was no longer entirely alone. The rain in Oregon didn't just fall, it oppressed. It was a constant freezing drizzle that soaked through clothes and chilled the bone. It was on one of these miserable gray Tuesdays that Brad Jenkins decided he had finally had enough of Leo's stoicism. Brad had suffered a rare humiliation that morning. He had failed a crucial algebra exam, and his father had publicly berated him over the phone in the school parking lot, threatening to take away his prized Jeep Wrangler. Brad's fragile, inflated ego was fractured, and he desperately needed a punching bag to restore his sense of power. He needed someone to break. When the final bell rang, Leo slipped out the side doors, pulling the collar of his thin denim jacket up against the stinging rain. He just wanted to get to the garage, to the comforting smell of oil and the safe, unspoken presence of the bikers. But as he turned into the narrow, brick-lined alleyway behind a local diner, a shortcut he took to avoid the main roads, 3 figures blocked his path. Brad, Greg, and Donnie stepped out from the shadows of a rusted dumpster. "Going somewhere, Ghost?" Brad sneered, his voice echoing off the wet brick walls. He stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. The rain plastered his blonde hair to his forehead, making him look feral. Leo stopped, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Just going to work, Brad. Let me pass." "Work?" Brad laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Where do you work, Leo? Scrubbing toilets? Picking up trash? You're garbage, Carmichael. You know that, right? Just poor, pathetic garbage." Greg and Donnie snickered, fanning out to block any route of escape. "Please," Leo said, his voice trembling slightly. He reached into his pocket out of nervous habit, his fingers brushing against the only item of value he owned, a silver, engraved pocket watch that had belonged to his late grandfather. It was broken, stuck forever at 3:15, but it was his anchor to a family he barely remembered. Brad's sharp eyes caught the movement. "What's in the pocket, Ghost?" "Got a weapon." Before Leo could react, Brad lunged, pinning Leo against the rough brick wall. He jammed his hand into Leo's pocket and ripped the silver watch out. "Give it back," Leo shouted, a sudden surge of protective panic overriding his fear. He shoved Brad in the chest. It was the first time Leo had ever fought back. The shock on Brad's face lasted only a second before it morphed into pure, unadulterated rage. "You don't touch me," Brad roared. He threw the antique watch onto the wet asphalt and slammed the heel of his heavy boot down on it. The sickening crunch of shattering glass and snapping metal echoed in the alley. Leo let out a strangled cry and dropped to his knees, frantically gathering the crushed silver and broken gears. That was when the beating began. Brad kicked Leo in the ribs, sending him sprawling into a muddy puddle. Greg and Donnie joined in, throwing punches and kicks while Brad barked orders. They beat him with the cowardly fury of boys who had never faced real consequences. They left Leo curled in a fetal position in the mud, gasping for air, blood pouring from his nose, and a deep gash above his eyebrow. "Clean yourself up, trash," Brad spat, flicking a cigarette butt onto Leo's wet jacket before turning and jogging away with his laughing crew. It took Leo 20 minutes to stand. His vision was blurred, his ribs screamed with every breath, and he tasted copper. He clutched the ruined pieces of his grandfather's watch in his trembling, bloodied fist. He didn't go to the hospital. He didn't go to the police. He limped the remaining 2 miles to Sullivan's garage in the pouring rain. When Leo finally pushed open the heavy steel side door of the garage, the noise inside instantly died. There were about a dozen full-patched Hell's Angels scattered around the shop floor. The roar of a tested engine was cut off. The harsh laughter ceased. Every single pair of eyes turned to the doorway. Leo stood there, soaked to the bone, dripping muddy water and blood onto the concrete. His face was a swollen, discolored mess, and he was violently shivering. He tried to walk toward the broom closet, tried to pretend everything was normal, but his legs gave out. He collapsed against a tool chest, sliding down to the floor. Grit Callahan was the first one to move. The massive sergeant-at-arms crossed the garage floor in 3 long strides. Close behind him was Dutch Higgins, a wiry, heavily tattooed biker who served as the chapter's enforcer. Grit knelt beside the boy. He didn't ask what happened. The damage spoke for itself. He gently pried Leo's clenched fist open, revealing the shattered remains of the silver pocket watch mixed with Leo's blood. Grit's jaw tightened. The veins in his thick neck bulged. The silence in the garage wasn't one of shock. It was a heavy, suffocating silence of gathering violence. The kind of silence that precedes a deadly storm. "Dutch," Grit said, his voice deadly calm, never taking his eyes off Leo's battered face. "Lock the bay doors. Grab the first aid kit." Dutch nodded grimly, stepping away. Grit looked back at Leo. The kid was trying to hold back tears, shame mixing with the physical agony. "You're done being quiet, kid," Grit rumbled softly, wiping a streak of mud from Leo's forehead with a shop rag. "I need a name, right now." Leo looked up into the cold, terrifyingly calm eyes of the Hell's Angel. He realized in that moment that the men in this room were not constrained by the rules that protected Brad Jenkins. They didn't care about his dad's money or his football trophies. Leo swallowed hard, his voice rasping through his ruined lips. Brad Jenkins." Grit stood up slowly. He turned to the rest of the club members who had gathered in a tight, silent semicircle around them. The shadows in the garage seemed to stretch and deepen. Grit didn't yell. He didn't make a grand speech. He simply looked at Dutch, then at the others. "Find out everything," Grit commanded softly. "Where he lives, where he eats, where he breathes. We are going to teach a boy what real monsters look like." The retribution of the Hells Angels was rarely a chaotic explosion of violence. It was a cold, calculated dismantling of an enemy's life. For Thomas "Grit" Callahan and Dutch Higgins, Brad Jenkins wasn't just a high school bully. He was a localized tyrant who had laid hands on someone under their protection. In the outlaw biker world, respect and consequence are the twin pillars of existence. Brad was about to be introduced to both. For the first 48 hours after the alleyway beating, Brad lived in his usual state of arrogant bliss. He strutted through the hallways of Creston High, chest puffed out, reveling in the fact that Leo Carmichael hadn't shown up for classes. Brad assumed he had finally broken the quiet kid, permanently driving him out of the social ecosystem. He bragged to Greg and Donnie about the crunch of the silver pocket watch, framing it as a righteous victory over a peasant. But by Friday evening, the atmosphere in Brad's privileged world began to subtly shift. It started with a low, distant rumble. Brad was leaving a team dinner at a local steakhouse, casually spinning the keys to his pristine lifted Jeep Wrangler. As he stepped into the cool, damp Oregon air, he noticed a solitary figure, leaning against a rusted lamppost across the street. The man was massive, clad in heavy denim and worn leather, a cigarette glowing faintly in the twilight. Parked directly next to him was a sprawling, customized Harley-Davidson. The man wasn't doing anything illegal. He wasn't even looking directly at Brad. But the sheer imposing presence sent an involuntary shiver down the teenager's spine. Brad quickly climbed into his Jeep, locking the doors with a sharp beat. As he pulled out of the lot, the rumble of the Harley roared to life. The ride home to his affluent suburban neighborhood usually took 15 minutes. That night it felt like an eternity. The single headlight of the chopper stayed exactly 3 car lengths behind him. When Brad sped up, the bike matched his pace effortlessly. When Brad took an erratic, unnecessary detour through a residential subdivision to shake in, the biker smoothly followed, leaning into the corners with predatory grace. Panic, a completely foreign emotion to Brad Jenkins, began to claw at his throat. He pulled into his sweeping, circular driveway, practically slamming the Jeep into park, and sprinted to his front door. When he looked back, the biker had stopped at the end of the driveway. The man calmly revved his engine, once a deafening, bone-rattling roar that echoed through the quiet neighborhood before shifting into gear and vanishing into the night. The psychological warfare had officially begun. By Monday, the invisible noose was tightening. Brad noticed them everywhere. A burly, heavily tattooed man sitting in a corner booth at the diner where Brad and his friends ate lunch, slowly stirring his coffee while staring dead-eyed at their table. 2 bikers parked across from the Creston High football field during practice, their arms crossed over their cuts, silently watching Brad run drills. The coaching staff, usually quick to chase off loiterers, suddenly developed severe tunnel vision, completely ignoring the menacing spectators. Brad's arrogance quickly corroded into profound paranoia. He stopped sleeping. He snapped at Greg and Donnie, alienating his only allies. The locker room, once his undisputed domain, felt like a trap. He was constantly looking over his shoulder, jumping at the sound of a revving engine blocks away. Dutch Higgins, the chapter's enforcer, had taken the lead on the reconnaissance. Dutch was a ghost when he wanted to be, a man who possessed a terrifying talent for gathering intelligence. He hadn't just followed Brad, he had audited the teenager's entire existence. Dutch discovered the illegal modifications on Brad's Jeep, the exact routes he took, and, most importantly, the foundation of Brad's bloated ego, his father, Richard Jenkins. Richard was a big fish in a small pond, a man who believed his money shielded his family from the consequences of the real world. Dutch dug into the auto dealerships. He found the shady accounting, the corner-cutting on vehicle inspections, and the under-the-table payoffs to local zoning officials. The Hells Angels didn't just have muscle, they had leverage. On Wednesday afternoon, Richard Jenkins was sitting in his plush corner office at the flagship dealership when the glass doors of his showroom swung open. 4 full-patched Hells Angels walked in. They didn't draw weapons. They didn't shout. They simply walked past the terrified receptionists, the polished sedans, and straight into Richard's office, locking the heavy mahogany door behind them. Grit Callahan sat in the leather guest chair across from Richard's sprawling desk. Dutch stood by the window, blocking the only exit. "Mr. Jenkins," Grit began, his voice a low, gravelly purr that made the hair on Richard's arms stand up. "We need to have a conversation about investments. Specifically, the poor investments your son has been making with his fists." Richard, usually blustering and domineering, found his mouth completely dry. He recognized the winged death's head on their vests. He knew exactly who these men were. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, his bravado evaporating in seconds. Dutch tossed a thick manila folder onto Richard's desk. It landed with a heavy thud. Inside were photographs of Leo Carmichael's battered face, followed by detailed, incriminating documents regarding Richard's shady business practices. "Your boy likes to beat on a kid who works in our garage," Grit stated coldly, leaning forward, his massive frame dwarfing the desk. "He broke a family heirloom. He left him bleeding in an alley. Now, in our world, a debt like that gets paid in blood. But we figured you're a businessman. We figured you'd prefer a different transaction." Richard looked at the photos of Leo, then at the financial documents. He realized with absolute terrifying clarity that these men could destroy his business, his reputation, and his son with a single phone call or a single violent visit. "What do you want?" Richard whispered, thoroughly defeated. "We want an education for your boy," Grit replied, standing up slowly. "And we want you to facilitate the classroom. Tomorrow night. The old quarry on Route 9. Ring him, or we'll come fetch him ourselves, and I promise you our transportation methods are a lot less comfortable." The old limestone quarry on Route 9 was a desolate, jagged crater carved into the Oregon hills. It was a place where teenagers used to drink, but the sheer drops and jagged rocks had made it infamous and largely abandoned. The Thursday night air was bitterly cold, the sky clear and choked with bright, indifferent stars. Richard Jenkins' luxury SUV crunched over the gravel, its headlights cutting through the absolute darkness. In the passenger seat, Brad was trembling uncontrollably. His father hadn't told him where they were going, only that he had screwed up worse than he could ever imagine. When the SUV rolled to a halt in the center of the quarry basin, the headlights illuminated a terrifying tableau. 20 Hells Angels stood in a wide, imposing semicircle, blocking the only road out. Their motorcycles were parked in a neat row behind them, the chrome glinting in the pale moonlight. At the center of the semicircle stood Grit Callahan and Dutch Higgins, and standing right beside Grit, looking small but surprisingly steady, was Leo Carmichael. "Get out," Richard snapped at his son, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and utter terror. Brad stumbled out of the vehicle. His legs felt like lead. The towering linebacker, the undisputed king of Creston High, looked incredibly small, surrounded by the towering, silent outlaws. The silence in the quarry was absolute, save for the crunch of Brad's expensive sneakers on the gravel as he was marched toward the center. Rit stepped forward. He didn't raise his hand, but the sheer weight of his stare pinned Brad to the spot. "Bradley," Grit said, his voice echoing slightly off the limestone walls. "You like to play games in alleys. You like to pick on people who don't fight back. You thought you were the biggest, baddest thing in this valley." Brad couldn't speak. He looked at his father for help, but Richard was staring firmly at the ground, utterly emasculated and unwilling to meet his son's eyes. The realization hit Brad like a physical blow. His father's money, his status, his football tackles, none of it meant anything here. He was entirely at the mercy of men who operated outside his reality. "Look at him," Dutch commanded, stepping out of the shadows, pointing a heavily ringed finger at Leo. Brad slowly turned his gaze to Leo. The swelling on Leo's face had gone down, but the bruising was still a vivid, ugly yellow and purple. Yet Leo wasn't looking at the ground anymore. He was looking directly into Brad's eyes, his expression unreadable, flanked by 20 of the most dangerous men in the state. "You broke his property. You spilled his blood," Grit continued, his tone deadly and even. "In our club, we operate on respect. You showed none. So now, you're going to pay the toll." Grit reached into his leather cut and pulled out a small, heavy velvet pouch. He tossed it into the gravel at Brad's feet. "Pick it up," Grit ordered. Brad scrambled to his knees, his hands shaking violently as he retrieved the pouch. He opened the drawstring. Inside rested a brand-new, exquisitely crafted silver pocket watch. It wasn't the exact same one, that was impossible, but it was an expensive, beautiful vintage piece. "You bought that," Grit informed him coldly. "Your daddy financed it, but it's from you. Hand it to him, and apologize. Like you mean it." Brad stood up on trembling legs. He walked the few paces over to Leo. The proximity to the massive bikers made Brad's chest tight with panic. He looked at Leo, the kid he had treated like garbage for years. Brad choked on the words. He swallowed hard, tears of pure terror and humiliation pricking his eyes. "I'm sorry, Leo. I'm so sorry. I won't ever touch you again." He held out the velvet pouch. Leo looked at the pouch, then up at Brad. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply took the pouch from Brad's shaking hand. "Keep your distance, Brad," Leo said quietly, his voice finally steady. "I don't ever want to see you looking my way again." Grit stepped between them, his towering frame casting a long shadow over Brad. "You hear that, Bradley? He's a ghost to you now. You don't look at him. You don't speak his name. You don't even breathe the same air if you can help it. Because if you do, if he comes into my shop with so much as a paper cut, I won't arrange a meeting with your father. I will just come for you." Grit leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "Do we have an understanding?" "Yes, sir," Brad sobbed out, his bravado entirely broken, reduced to a terrified child in the dark. "Get out of here," Dutch barked. "Both of you." Richard Jenkins didn't need to be told twice. He practically dragged his weeping son back to the SUV. The tires spun in the gravel as they sped out of the quarry, desperate to escape the nightmare they had stumbled into. As the taillights faded into the distance, the heavy tension in the quarry finally lifted. The bikers began to relax, some lighting cigarettes, a low murmur of conversation starting up. Grit looked down at Leo. He placed a heavy, calloused hand on the teenager's shoulder, giving it a firm, reassuring squeeze. "You did good, kid. Held your ground." Leo clutched the velvet pouch in his hand. It couldn't replace his grandfather's watch, but it represented something far more valuable. It represented the end of his fear. He looked up at the towering sergeant-at-arms surrounded by the rough, imposing men who had chosen to stand behind an invisible kid. "Thank you, Grit," Leo said softly. "Don't mention it," Grit replied, a faint, rare smile touching the corners of his scarred lips. "Now come on, let's get back to the garage. Those floors aren't going to sweep themselves." As Leo climbed onto the back of Grit's chopper, the roar of 20 Harley-Davidsons shattered the silence of the night. They rode out of the quarry together, a thundering wave of chrome and leather. Leo was no longer a ghost, haunting the hallways of Creston High. He rode with the shadows, and for the first time in his life, he was completely untouchable. Sometimes the quietest victims have the loudest protectors. Leo found his sanctuary where no one expected, proving that true respect isn't demanded through fear, it's earned through loyalty. If this story of brutal karma and unexpected justice kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and make sure to subscribe for more unbelievable true stories.